Good afternoon, and thanks again for joining us. My name is Kurt Bullard, and I'm a first-year MBA student at Sloan. It's my pleasure today to introduce our panel, a conversation with Mark Cuban and Andy Slavitt. Our panelists today are Mark Cuban, owner of the Dallas Mavericks, and Andy Slavitt, senior advisor on the White House COVID response team. Our panel today will be moderated by Nate Silver, editor-in-chief of 538. The panel will run for 35 minutes, and we will leave 10 minutes at the end for Q&A. Please use Twitter using the hashtag CubanSlavitt to ask questions online. With that, I'll turn it over to Nate.
Good afternoon, everybody. Hello, Andy, and hello, Mark. I'm going to spend most of our time here asking about COVID and some sports-related COVID topics, but not purely sports by any means. In part because, like, in my head, I kind of associate the Sloan conference with COVID. It happened in mid-March last year, kind of right when the pandemic was becoming very bad in the United States. I think I had like 2 or 3 separate exposures that were Sloan related where I had to quarantine from at one point. But I want to kind of take us back to March 11th, 2020, which is the day that Tom Hanks diagnosed himself with COVID, Rudy Gobert did. The WHO declared a global pandemic. I mean, Mark, you kind of had like a front row seat for all this. You're kind of seen at a Mavericks game in disbelief as the season was being canceled. I mean, what was that like? Can you take us through kind of what your thoughts were at the time, how you thought things would play out?
Well, let me start earlier that day. Obviously, you know, there was a lot of conversation and discussion about COVID and the pandemic and what was going to happen. And I went through my normal routine, going to the arena, and I walked into the locker room because a lot of the guys had questions. And so we took a few minutes for me to answer any questions about what I thought would happen. And we went around and I said, look, you know, I don't really know for certain. And I remember Luca asking me the last question saying, you know, there were things being canceled in Europe. Did I think that we'd have games canceled here in the NBA? And I'd say 5-10% chance. I don't really expect it, but we'll know when we walk on the court, because the wisdom of the crowd obviously will tell us that, you know, if there's a bunch of empty seats for a sold out game, then people are afraid. If there's not, then maybe they know something we don't, and we'll find out. And so we go out to the court, every seat was taken. Now, you know, I mean, the no-shows, there's always a few, but there weren't many. And so the game went on, and I'm thinking nothing of it. And then in the third quarter, as everybody saw, I got the text saying that, or shown the text saying that the season had been suspended, and I was stunned, you know. And so then, you know, my mind started going, okay, what happens now, right? You know, I've got a lot of responsibilities to the organization, my other businesses, my family, you know, the country in general. You know, how are we all going to respond to this? And you know, that's really where my mind went at that point in time.
I mean, Andy, did you have a moment where, I think it's kind of tricky because I think one thing Mark is kind of getting at a little bit here is like, you can have like an intellectual recognition that COVID was going to be pretty bad, right? Like I knew at the Sloan conference, I was like, I kind of know objectively it's going to be the last time we have like a big gathering like this for a while. I thought a while meant a few months and not a year and a half, right? But emotionally, it took longer to hit me. I was on a plane that day flying to see some family when the Gobert news hit and the Tom Hanks news hit. But do you have a moment where it registered for you, Andy, that COVID was going to be a really, really big problem for the United States?
Yeah. Well, like Mark, I was also at an extremely huge basketball game. This is my son Zach's Minnesota semifinal varsity tournament game, and it was at the exact moment. But I go back a little bit earlier. It was in February, and some people who were studying pandemics sent me a graph, and a governor sent me a graph, and it was really showing kind of what happened in South Korea and in Italy. And it was just at the beginning of when South Korea was flat and Italy's curve was going up. And I asked the question, well, what will it take for us to look more like South Korea than Italy? And the person said, oh, it's too late. And they explained to me how, in fact, a lot of it's invisible, not being tested, can't see it, et cetera. And I remember standing in my hallway with sort of 50 consequences hitting me at the same time. And then a night later, I went on MSNBC, and just to show you how much this was in people's consciousness, there was a 54-minute show on other topics, including, Michael Bloomberg's non-consent agreements and all this. And in the last minute, they brought me on the show, and I said, "Hey, we might be having a pandemic here." And so obviously things happened very quickly after that.
Yeah, no, it kind of happened at this background of the Democratic primary was all happening during this time. It was kind of a wild period. I mean, I want to ask both about the individual response and the governmental response and how those overlap. I guess I'll start with the governmental response to keep you on the line here, Andy. I mean, let's say we do have now the benefit of hindsight. But let's say for some reason, the Biden administration takes over on January 20th, 2020. What would you have done differently? Was it already too late, or what were the key early, missteps?
Yeah. Well, look, nobody was going to get it perfect, and I shouldn't pretend in a do-over the hindsight's easy. What I would say is, just judging by how President Biden has approached the vaccines, I think he would have approached things like testing and national testing in the same way, which is namely to aggressively take federal accountability in partnership with states, rather than what I think happened, which is that the federal government was very eager to get the country open, obviously, not doing nothing, but also not wanting to be responsible for everything that happened with the pandemic. And there were plenty of people inside the administration, by the way, who I think wanted to do more, but were afraid to get out a little bit in front of their boss, and who didn't want to treat this as aggressively. And I think when you have 50 states and territories, each with their own best effort, each trying to buy supplies, each trying to figure out a testing strategy in the middle of having shortages, in the middle of states which don't have real public health departments or budgets, and the federal government does, you're just hobbling yourself. And I think so. At some level, I think there is some fair criticism. There were also just plain mistakes that are made in the heat of battle. CDC had a couple of well-publicized errors and so forth. Do I think that was the whole equation? No, I don't. I think, the public's inexperience with pandemics in the U.S. really showed, as compared to places like Hong Kong and Africa and other parts of the world where they'd had more experience, and so reflexively they took public health measures more seriously. We had I think a much more prolonged debate about liberties and other kinds of things. So there are some things that I don't think government would have necessarily been able to control for, but there certainly were some things I think that they could have.
Yeah, I remember being in New York in a couple of days after Sloan, right? Kind of, it was like you see a movie where like 25% of the people are removed from the picture. It was kind of eerie, right? And I'm like, oh, I can go and do all these things where it's not crowded, right? There's like not a line. It's hard to get into a restaurant, right? It was idiotic, of course, right? There was a ton of transmission in New York happening at the time. So 25% of people were being smart. I was being dumb. But I mean, Mark, you mentioned before how you had a full capacity crowd at the Mavericks game that night. And you kind of are charged with predicting human behavior in a business context. I mean, what surprised you about people's response to COVID?
Not a lot, because of the lack of information. The fundamental underpinning of all of this was a simple question: who do we trust with our lives? And we really didn't know who to trust. And when you don't know who to trust for something this important, everybody kind of looks inward and tries to make the best decision that they can. But when you do that with so little information, then you get a lot of disjointed, responses. And, the fact, like Andy mentioned, we put liberties first. We didn't go to people with, we didn't go where the expertise was. We left it to states who may or may not have had expertise. We left it to individual municipalities and cities, and mayors, and, it was crazy, as opposed to saying, okay, who is best suited to dealing with these issues? And I dealt with the White House quite a bit in terms of dealing with PPE, and you talk about a clusterfuck. It was everybody out for themselves, everybody doing deals.
Yeah.
You know, I remember saying to, and I don't want to drop names, but the people that I was speaking to in the White House, and I'm like, look, you need to come up with an exchange, and you need to come up with a database where we continuously pull all the people who need PPE, hospitals, you know, all the providers and all the sources, and let's find out what's available, because otherwise everybody's competing for limited supplies. That's driving up prices. That's creating inefficiencies, and people are overbuying, double and triple and quadruple buying just to try to come up with enough masks. And we weren't, you know, I called out 3M as an example, because they weren't providing any information, and the federal government should have been getting the information from the largest suppliers. They literally sent me, these people I was involved with sent me, there's a company outside of Fort Worth called Prestige Ameritech to try to help them get organized so that they could produce enough masks and source it to the government, because they didn't know how to deal with each other. It was just really, really a mess, because of lack of focus and lack of organization.
Nate, can I toss in just two
Of course.
things here that I think are important? And you know, Mark is somewhat an example of one. Is one of the things that I did when I got here was I set up calls with every business, every CEO, tech industry, retailers, sports leagues, or everybody. And what was amazing, as you would expect, everybody wanted to help. Everybody said, "What can I do?" And I think it was a missed opportunity over the first year, because you know, somebody said something really smart to me at one point, which was, it's easier to do something than to do nothing. And we asked Americans to do nothing. You know, there was a period of time when people were sewing masks, and I think they felt productive and they felt involved, and I think that was good. But when they had no energy for stuff, it was just turned into mischief and trouble. And so I think we missed an opportunity to rally the country. Whether people liked the president or not, people I think would have rallied if he would have called on them. And I think, you know, Mark, very early on, people may remember, made a statement about how he was going to care for the employees of the Mavericks. And what was so compelling about it is there was a void, and there was an opportunity for someone to step up and say, here's the way to do things. Here's a way to do things. Why don't you consider following? And we could have done that at greater scale. I think we would have been a lot better off, and it would have felt a lot better. The second thing is just telling the public the truth. Good news or bad news, straight facts. And because we're going to ask a lot of the public, and you are, when you ask the public to potentially risk their business, you know, change their life, be away from their family, you know, you got to basically say, look, folks, this isn't going to be over tomorrow. And you can't keep promising a miracle around the corner, or it gets very fatiguing. So it's a hard thing to do, but whether it's good news or bad, to just square it off with the public and say, you know, you're smart enough to know what to do, but we got to give you all the facts we know.
Yeah, I remember telling people, you know, and I thought it was prescient at the time, because I'm like, everybody's saying, okay, if you have something in March or April, it might get canceled by a friend who had a vacation in May. I'm like, I'm sure by May you'll be fine, right? I think you'd actually taken time to like produce a proper forecast. You know how long these pandemics last, right? And that probably wasn't very realistic, but yeah. I do want to ask a couple of sports related questions. So now, Andy, happily, we are kind of in a phase now getting back to some phases of normal in some parts of the country, at least. More and more people are being vaccinated. I actually went for the first time in more than a year to a live sporting event the other night. I went to a Yankees game. 20% capacity, you have to have proof of vaccination or a negative test. So it felt quite safe. But what do you feel about protocols like that? Is it too soon for people going back to live sporting venues? Is outdoors different than indoors? Does it differ in, say, Michigan right now, where they're having an outbreak? Is it too much to have full attendance like they're having in Texas right now? What do you think about that?
So I would say that we are probably within a couple of months, we will be substantially close to that place. You know, I would say that, putting aside regional differences for a second, you know, if we get through what I think is going to happen with the remainder of the vaccinations, and they have the kind of effect that they've had in places like Israel, where you've got average of 7 people dying every day, They've got about 2/3 of their public has had their first shot. We have about 45% of adults the first shot. So when we get to that point, I think which I think we're very close to. I mean, a couple months sounds like a long time when you're looking ahead. It's not very long at all when you're looking behind you. If we can get to that place, I think we're going to be in really good shape. And let's think ahead. We want schools open in the fall. We want sports going on in the fall. We want all those things. So I think we got to suck it up for a couple more months. I don't think we're entirely there yet. Obviously, individual decisions are a different matter. There are a lot of low risk things you can do, particularly if you've been vaccinated. Just remember that, half the country hasn't been vaccinated yet. So we can't, what I find happens a lot is the same person the day before they're vaccinated is yelling and screaming about variants and they're worried. The day after they get vaccinated, they're yelling and screaming about not being able to eat indoors at restaurants. It's human nature, but we're very split right now. And if you're in one camp, you got to remember that there's a whole bunch of people that are in that other camp.
So you think vaccinated people should kind of be more careful than they maybe need to be as a show of solidarity, sort of?
No, I think you'd recognize that, like, the reason we're not opening up everything and all travel and all airport and all these things is because we've got a lot of people that still aren't there yet. The vaccines are not 100% effective. They're damn close, but there are breakthrough cases. There are people with immunological issues who can't take the vaccine. So as long as this thing is spreading, we're going to continue to have some measure of public safety measures in place. But when we get to a place like, I'm calling it 4th of July, I don't think we'll be at a herd immunity. But I don't think we as a country wait until we get to a herd immunity. I think we get to a reasonable place where it's safe for most people. Some people are going to continue to take precautions, but if I had to forecast ahead, I'd say that is, and it's, which is dangerous to do. I'd say, we continue to vaccinate at the current rate. Lots of stuff will be open. Again, you as an individual, you've got a lot more freedom if you've had a vaccine. But if you're frustrated that your restaurant is only open 25% to the public or 50% to the public, you have to understand that's why.
Mark, how do you feel about this notion of vaccine passports? At the Yankees game, you actually have some people using what's called an Excelsior passport. So why do you hate that idea?
Hate it. And it's not even an individual liberty. It's almost an excuse for people not to get vaccinated. I think we need to just keep on pushing till we get to whatever that herd immunity number is. And by putting together a vaccine passport program, you're going to freak people out. The people who are least likely to get vaccinated are the ones that are going to rebel the most against a vaccine passport, and you're going to give them another reason not to be vaccinated. And that's just awful to me. Whereas we're starting to break down the vaccine hesitancy, and more people are realizing, like we had guys on our team, their grandmas, or granddads got vaccinated, and that reduced their hesitancy and opened them up to taking it. If now you introduce a vaccine passport and the next thing you know is they're saying, well, that's just the first step towards, tracking this, and this, we're taking my guns away or whatever it may be, how these things work, then I think that's awful. And so I'm not a fan. I think we just focus on, educating people that are hesitant to get the vaccine, and that kind of takes care of the problem itself.
So if American Airlines says, as a business decision, we're going to be the airline for vaccinated people, and we're going to be the safest airline, you don't have to wear masks on American Airlines. Do you think they should have, A, do you think it would be a terrible business decision or a good one? And B, do you think they should have the right to do that?
They have the right to do that, and they'll find out if it's good or bad. Yeah. It's like the same as a lot of other things where, in this country now, for better or worse, whether it's gun control or vaccine passports, we've defined these trigger issues as things we have to take a stand on, right? We're immutable in our positions. This is who we are. This is our brand identity as individuals. We bandwagon everything in this country. And so sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. But I just think because of just the way the numbers, the data that I've seen says that, there's the people who are hesitant on vaccines are the ones least likely to support any type of government-driven documentation. I think it would be a huge mistake, but from a business perspective, it's going to be up to each individual business.
Andy, we are at a point now where, fortunately, the number of vaccines going into arms every day has increased a lot to 3 point some million. Some days even you get to 4 million. But we're at a phase now where we're going from having a supply shortage to, I think it's not quite right to say a demand shortage. It's a little more complicated than that. But talk to me about vaccine access and hesitancy issues, right? There are a group of people in polls who say they want to get the vaccine, they haven't gotten it yet, right? There's another group who say, I'm kind of on the fence. Talk to me about those two groups and what the White House and states and localities can do to help increase the number as close to 100% as possible.
It's a great question, and I think it's going to be one of the most important questions over the next couple of months. Is there are a lot of people who just said, I want this vaccine as soon as it's ready. And they're mostly people over 50, people at high risk. People tend to be skew a little higher in education, experience, et cetera, trust in science, you can imagine. There's a large group of people that said, you know what, I'll take it, but I don't want to go first. Those people, I think, are getting off the fence and getting the vaccine because, we've seen 120 million vaccines in this country alone. We've seen a very good safety record, and we've seen obviously, a dramatic decrease in death that's beginning, and particularly if you look at nursing homes and places where there have been high amounts of vaccination. So I think that there's a few things that characterize the groups that are current fence sitters. One is they don't tend to trust big organizations. They don't trust government. They don't trust big pharma. They don't trust, and so the good news is like, I think about this like a product. Do your homework and decide for yourself. And so when people started talking about, hey, is the government going to launch a big persuasion campaign? They were kind of disappointed when I said, nobody wants to be persuaded. They want to be informed. They want to get straight answers. They shouldn't have to learn about it on some Facebook group, with a skull and crossbones over a vaccine, or like a 40-foot looking needle where someone's trying to tell them that which is exactly what you'd see on places like Facebook. So our approach, if we had to describe it in a way that sounded like systemized and PowerPointy, and I don't particularly love the term, is really helping to inform trusted messengers. Most people say the people they trust are doctors, nurses, pharmacists, friends and family, people locally, church leaders. So our entire effort, the federal government, is just getting good quality information to those people. Second thing is friction. All of the behavioral economists tell us that the people there's a lot of people they're not anti-vaccine, they're not even negative. They're just like, they're not going to lift a finger to go get it. If they walked into a pharmacy and that pharmacy had vaccines available and said, hey, do you want one? They take it. Or they walked into the Mavericks game and, there was a station, they take it. But if they had to make an appointment, wait in line, it's just not worth it. Because for them, and for a lot of people, if you're under 30, you're not that scared. You're not that scared. So you do it, but you wouldn't make a lot of effort. So what the implication of that is, we got to go from these big mass vaccination sites to ubiquity. Putting vaccines everywhere, having walk-in appointments everywhere. Bars should be doing shots for a shot. Games, schools, everywhere. And I think what happens is you'll get to some percentage, and then we'll start trickling. So for seniors, we're at like 77%, and we're going to now fight. We're going to get to 80%, and we're going to fight for every 5,000 additional seniors. And a lot of them, it's going to be about bringing them to their homes and mobile vans, and they're hard for them to get out. And then I think 50 to 80 will go, 50 to 65 will go really well. But under 50, I think we're going to be really, really struggling and pushing and trying to make the case, because I think we got a lot of people that they're not paying that much attention to it, and they're not that worried about it.
Yeah, I mean, one thing is, and it's also an information gap, right? I basically took a few weeks ago to just learn literally everything I could about vaccine administration in New York City. But I had the luxury of doing that as an information savvy person who had the time on my hands to do it. And I think there are a lot of people out there probably don't even know that the vaccine is available for them in their group yet necessarily. But Mark,
that'll take.
I mean, you
way,
obviously think a lot about
it's important to talk about misinformation too, because I'll go, Mark, but But I think we're going to be fighting against a small group of people that are trying to spread messages that just aren't true about the vaccines.
Mark, you have a product that's fairly successful, but you want it to reach more hesitant customers, maybe customers who are not reading the news all the time. I mean, what would you do? Could you have stations at Mavericks games you can get vaccinated, or what?
Oh yeah, of course.
What?
Yeah, of course. I like, shots for shots, especially with the J&J. You walk in and J&J is better suited for younger populations because the 73% versus the 94% isn't nearly as impactful for them. And so whether it's, come to a game, if you have, if there's availability of J&J, giving them out at Mavs games, absolutely. With restaurants I'm involved with, other events that I'm involved with, incentivizing people. Yes. I mean, it's good for business because the minute things open back up, the snapback is already starting to happen, right? You already see Vegas and other destination places really starting to just explode on the weekends. But now, imagine a conference where there's going to be 100,000 participants and, you don't need a vaccine passport, but just showing your card and come on in. And if you haven't, here's a chance just to get your vaccination. Welcome to Vegas or welcome to the Dallas Convention Center for your event. There's so many ways to deal with that. But I think, and where sports really plays a part is, we're having vaccination sections. We're letting people in who have been vaccinated. There are rewards that we are offering that entice people to get vaccinated. And to Andy's point, the more of your friends that have experienced positive outcomes, the more likely you're going to do it. And that the number of those people is just expanding exponentially right now, 4 million a day. And you'll get to the point where you'll have to explain to somebody in your family or somebody at work or others around you why you don't have a vaccine. And that's going to become even more of a hassle than getting it. Because Andy's right. If you're 25 years old and half the people have already had COVID and it was fine, and so you don't think twice about it, but you get to the point where your mom's asking you or your dad's asking you, who you dating and have you got a vaccine, and why haven't you got it? And that's the dinner table conversation all the time. Then it's going to be more hassle to not have it than to get it. And I think that's where we overcome a lot of the hesitancy.
Mark, I have a hot take for you. My hot take is that NBA players and professional athletes should have been eligible for the vaccine much earlier on. Do you agree or disagree?
Agree. We tried. I mean, particularly the communities that look up to them and their social media followings, it would have really simplified things. But, there's a lot more involved than just everybody saying yes or no. And that's just the reality.
If I am going to give you an over-under, and I'm going to give Andy an over-under. If I were to give you an over-under, I would say that 60% of NBA players will have received at least one dose of the vaccine by April 30th, end of the month. Would you take the over or the under?
Oh, the over
60%.
Easily.
Okay.
Yeah, the over. Sure.
Andy, I'll give you a different over-under, not about sports. We are currently averaging in the US about 66,000 new detected COVID cases per day, per the New York Times. By a month from now, so May 9th, if you had to guess, you can go probabilistic if you want, would you say the number will be higher or lower?
I'm going to dodge that only because I feel like I don't have the liberty to answer as me, but it'll be attributed to White House policy. And so sadly I'll be speaking for a bunch of other people whose opinions I don't have here. So I love doing this with you, and I would.
Nate, I'll jump in. I'll take that one. I think the reality is the number of cases will become irrelevant because the reality of the vaccine is that it's not that it 100% protects cases, it's 100% protects from a lot of the impact of the virus. Or not 100%, but for the most part, very, very close to 100%. And so we'll see, you're already starting to see the number of hospitalizations crater, and that's the leading indicator, and correct me if I'm wrong, for deaths. And so as you start to see hospitals not have to make accommodations for COVID any longer, we don't count the number of flu cases to determine what our activity is going to be. And I'm not trying to make an analogy, an absolute analogy between flu and COVID on a seriousness level. But at the same time, in terms of just how we get back to daily activity and the things that alarm us, I think we'll pay far more attention to the number of hospitalizations and the utilization rates, because that'll really be the thing that matters. Because, according to, and Andy, correct me if I'm wrong, everything that I read, that it doesn't make you immune to catching something, but the viral impact and the impact on, of the virus is significantly lessened. So, the impact is not near where it was. And so I don't think we'll make as big a deal.
The only thing I'd alter about that is that what you're saying, I think hopefully will be true in a short amount of time. Right now, hospitalizations are still trending up on a national basis, because in a few states they're trending up a lot because the variant is 60% or so more contagious. So we're seeing about 5 to 10% increases in hospitalizations right now, which is a little bit confusing because we got all these factors, some depressing it, some increasing it. But what you can say is if you look at Israel, which is a little bit ahead of us, hospitalizations are exactly where what Mark is saying are way down. So this is where the really tough part for us, for all of us, for sure, but certainly from a messaging standpoint, from my perspective, is to message to people that we're so close but not there yet, because people really want to be there yet. And there's been no good news for so long that at the signs of good news that we're seeing, and Mark is absolutely right about deaths, people are back to if they go back to normal activity, the math works in such a way that the spread level increase along with the variant level increase means that enough people that are not vaccinated, mostly people under 50, are starting to get it because the variants, just consider the variants, call it 30 to 60, call it 50% more likely to get you, and enough people haven't been vaccinated yet that on a net basis we're still going up a little bit. What it tells me is if there was no vaccination program, we'd be looking like Europe, right? We'd have a real spike right now. We don't. We've got this little tiny thing, and I think that little tiny thing is accounting for some more hospitalizations, and still 700 people died yesterday. So I agree with Mark about where this is headed. I would just ask the public to try to give us a couple more months.
I mean, part of the messaging, because I was going to say part of the messaging we're using to that end is like I'm using with my family, right? I have 3 kids, 11, 14, and 18, and only the oldest has been vaccinated. And we're saying, look, my 14-year-old can still catch it. My 11-year-old can still catch it. And so most kids have not been vaccinated yet. And so that's why we have to still be vigilant, and we can't just, open things up without taking the same precautions that we had taken right in the middle of each wave, that we have to really be careful. I mean, part I'm getting at is I kind of make forecasts for a living. I don't make COVID forecasts, but you can go to CDC platform and see they have 20 different people who make forecasts, and they're all over the place as far as what's going to happen in the US, right? Some show a 4th wave, some show Israel, and some show a plateau. But Andy, what's it like when you're now on the inside, and it seems like there is sometimes some ambiguity about, on the one hand, wanting to give people an accurate forecast, on the other hand, trying to encourage people to be careful. I mean, am I wrong to identify some tension there in public health, especially if you're now working for the White House?
We're trying to be very honest about. We're trying to be honest about the tension itself. So I host these briefings with Rochelle Walensky and Dr. Fauci, who she runs the CDC, and the 3 of us. And someone wrote this piece about it. It's like she's, it's sort of like you got a mom and a dad. You got like all these voices, and it's not really orchestrated. I mean, we just tell the scientists, speak your minds. The message is confusing. It's hard to hold in your head at the same time caution and optimism, right? I mean, we're not used to it. But it's funny, when the vaccines first were coming out, there were people who were holding in their head at the same time, like, I'm not sure if I want it, and I can't believe I'm not getting it. I need mine. I want to get it now, but I'm not sure if I want it. So there's like, right, everybody's going through these sort of weird feelings. They're not always consistent. And we're in this sort of weird transition period where half the country is feeling like, hey, I've had it, I'm ready to move on. Half the country is feeling like, hey, what about me? And maybe half of that half is in the like, you go get it, better vaccine for thee, but not for me, and I'll just either free ride or not care. So we have to just recognize big country, broad, diverse. talking straight means that sometimes it's complex. I think the coherent message is we've got an accelerating threat. So we're trying to meet that accelerating threat with an accelerating response. That's why we're doing everything we are on the vaccine front and all these other fronts. We're trying to match it. We want people to participate in the fight with us so that they don't feel like, hey, it's the government doing this and I'm a passenger, I'm a passenger or standing by, but we're gonna do this. And that, yes, we know everyone's patience is short. We don't blame anybody for that. We know attitudes are different. We know that people want to put this behind us, and we do see an end in sight. And we do see it. And we haven't always said that. And the president's even said he's using 4th of July as both a call to action and a potential marker in time. And so, that's the thrust we're on. And sadly, as you know, with these things, Nate, is if facts change tomorrow, we will go back and say, that's how we saw things. And now we've got some new information. These variants caused people to start to feel differently about what's going to happen. And, your point about scenario and modeling, I get this model that has 4 or 5 variables to it, which creates like 60 some potential outcomes of how many people are getting vaccinated, what's going on with social measures, how quickly do vaccines wane in their effectiveness, what are the prevalence of variants, all of those variables. And you can imagine, like all the graphs, all the people on the call today can imagine, there's a graph for each one of those scenarios, and you debate and debate and debate what's likely to happen, and you're within a range, and there's room for lots of opinion in there. But what it tells you basically is vaccinate people as quickly as possible, try to wear masks as long as possible, and those are the things you can control. And if you do, you really have a muted kind of, you don't really have a big spike, you just have this kind of a muted period of time over the next couple of months before people get vaccinated. If you don't do those things, then the spike could turn into a spike.
And you have, 200 different metro areas where you have different dynamics, of course, right? And Michigan clearly has things going on very badly right now. I want to get to a few questions from the audience here. I know we're running a little short on time. Mark, what's your opinion on the Texas Rangers opening at 100% capacity, and kind of more generally, how do you feel about Texas's strategy? I mean, it gets a mix of credit and critique, obviously. Cases are not particularly high in Texas right now. They have been at points in time. How do you feel? Has Texas been a good or a bad example for the country?
Two elements there. One, in terms of what the Rangers did, obviously their decision, I would have done it differently. I wouldn't send my kids, and so, we would have done things differently. In terms of Texas generally, I was initially hesitant, but I think when they opened up the vaccine for everybody, and I think that really changed everybody's perspective on opening things up, and it really accelerated the acceptance of vaccines, because people didn't, people like Andy said, vaccine for thee, but not, they really started accepting it, and people really just started signing up and getting it. And the more people that signed up meant more people accepted it. And so I thought the opening it up was a really smart move from the vaccine perspective. Again, just opening up 100% everything from the state perspective, I would have done it differently. But I think the opening up the vaccines was to every adult was super smart.
Andy, I have a question for you from the 538 science desk, actually. And it might be the most important question, I think, globally that I proposed to either of you all day. But what can the U.S. do to start sending our excess vaccine doses abroad? And even since we partner with COVAX, do that on our own, what would be the strategies we would undertake there?
Yeah, I mean, so look, first of all, I think the president, like any head of state, his first obligation is to get this country vaccinated. We've had the most deaths by far. We've had 5 times the proportion of our deaths than needed. And so, I think he's been very clear about saying, we've got to do that. At the same time, we have to, I think, resume what we would consider to be our position as a global leader, not just in public health, but as an example across the country. So we've already sent doses to our neighbors, Mexico and Canada. I think that's just the beginning. As we get more confidence that we actually have things under control and have all the vaccines we need, which I think we're getting close to, but we're not there yet, we will do more of that. My hope is, I think we treat this like a war, and in a war, you try not to be single-threaded. You try to give yourself multiple options to have enough vaccines, for example. So if we do, and we're right, and we have more vaccines than needed, not a single one of those vaccines is going to sit on the shelf. They're all going to go around the world, and they're all going to go. We are putting together a strategy along with the national security team to make sure that we're doing that and doing that right. So in addition to COVAX, which we wrote the first check to, we put $4 billion commitment. We already put in $2 billion. We're getting those vaccines out. That is a first step in the process. We're also doing something which I know, I imagine Mark loves, is we're turning the U.S. into a manufacturer and exporter. We're building huge vaccine factories, and we're getting companies to work together. We announced a major agreement between Merck, who's the best manufacturer of vaccines in the world, and Johnson & Johnson. And we're going to be cranking out, and by the end of the year, we're going to be cranking out vaccines. And knock on wood, we do things right, we're going to be exporting much of those vaccines, even as we create the capacity in case we need boosters or in case we need production in the future. But it's both a national security play for us, so we don't need to rely on the rest of the world. But also, you can imagine the U.S. supplying not millions, but billions of doses of vaccines over the next couple of years to the world. That's what where we're hoping to be, and I feel good about where we are right now. Obviously, there's still some unknowns that could happen around the corner, and so the reason I think we're not committing to that aggressively yet is, what if a new variant that hit the U.S. that the vaccines didn't work on or didn't work very well on, and we needed another 400 or 500 million vaccines here. Well, we want to be ready for that too, and so we're just getting ready. But I'm very hopeful.
Because we're contracted for something like, I don't know how many total, right? But like 700 million doses or something. So that accounts for the possibility of needing a booster shot for some of these vaccines.
And also adolescents and kids around the corner as well. But yeah, that's right. That does account for both of those things.
Question for Mark. What has COVID taught us about the kind of sports fan experience, both maybe in arena and at home? And we have seen ratings be down this year across most sports. Do you think it tells us that we really need the in-person experience? It's essential. Do you think it tells us that there are more ways than ever to consume sports? Or what lessons have you taken away from fan reactions?
Yeah, before I get to that, let me just jump in on Andy's point. Andy, I just hope we don't give Merck and those pharma companies windfall profits out of all this, that if we're giving them money, we're asking either for a windfall profits tax or we're getting some equity or something in return, because it is a business relationship. So put that aside. And then in terms of what we've learned, we learned this summer that if sports are out of season and competing with each other, it's very difficult to get the same numbers that you did in the past. We learned that cord cutting is a significant impact on our ratings, and we have to be adapted. And we're kind of all sports are in the middle of an innovator's dilemma in terms of traditional linear television versus streaming. Now, that's not necessarily a COVID thing, but where COVID really hit us with this COVID summer in particular, people changed their viewing habits because Netflix and all the streaming companies realized that they've got to invest heavily in amazing content in order to compete with each other. And so that's given where there were 500 channels and nothing on before, now there's an unlimited number of great content that is an alternative to sports. Now, that said, I think things come back in our favor because of that competition between all those streaming organizations for subscribers, and most importantly, retention. It's very hard to come up with hits on an ongoing basis, and it's very expensive for them. And so I think they're going to come back to us, because when you have effectively a year-round season, because even our off seasons are now programmed, then sports become very valuable for retention. And so all these things came out of what we learned from COVID and the COVID summer.
Yeah, they give me a ton of, I'm sure, PhD papers done about like things that we learned from this kind of natural experiment where we collected so much data in an unusual circumstance. On that note, we're already about 2 minutes over time. I only got to about half the questions I had for you, but there's so much to talk about here that's not a surprise. So thank you, Mark. Thank you, Andy. Look forward to talking to you both again soon.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Nate. Thanks, Mark.
Appreciate it.